Have you heard the Latin term Imago Dei? It means image of God. It comes from a passage in the first chapter of the Bible where God speaks, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." We are image bearers, or Imago Dei. Certainly this perspective is not held by all people fighting poverty, but I'm convinced those who do acknowledge it will have more success. Why? Because faith not only impacts how we address poverty and its underlying issues, but even more directly, it benefits the poor themselves. First, let's look at how faith impacts our intervention. And before we go any further, it's important to understand when I use the word faith, I mean more literally the practice that flows out of one's faith. Some call this religion. In other words, the good for the poor that comes from faith doesn't come from simply believing, but practicing. So, how is our charitable practice impacted by faith? By our examination of God's character and our desire to emulate that character. Here are 3 characteristics of God that should impact how we help the poor. First, God is compassionate. Even when God's people were rebellious, Isaiah promised them, "Yet the Lord will be gracious to you. He will rise up to show you compassion." In the New Testament, James writes, "The Lord is full of compassion and mercy." So whether it's through instruction given thousands of years ago to care for widows and orphans, or from the stories of Jesus having compassion for the sick and hungry, this particular characteristic of God is not hard to find in Scripture. And it's one that not only informs our charity, but it's the fuel that drives it. Without compassion, charity is relegated to a mechanical and heartless transaction, failing to deliver love that every person needs. Second, God is just. The writer of Proverbs warns, "Don't exploit the poor or crush the needy in court, for the Lord will take up their case." And when God's people were guilty of this, they were judged by the prophet Ezekiel for oppressing the poor and needy, denying them justice. Certainly, this characteristic should impact how you and I fight poverty, to never take advantage of the poor, and even to defend against exploitation. Lastly, God is expectant. In the Bible, if you took the time to do the count, you'd find the word "if" used more than 1,400 times, and often in the context of God expressing expectation. A good example is the passage that names the ministry my wife and I co-founded, Watered Gardens. In Isaiah chapter 58, God promises His people that they'll be like a watered garden and like a spring whose waters never fail, if they extend themselves to the hungry, clothe the naked, bring the homeless poor into their houses. Even in the New Testament, we see expectation when Jesus tells the woman guilty of adultery, "Neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more." Whether it's an expectation that precedes a blessing or a blessing that precedes an expectation, God is expectant. And it's a characteristic you and I should practice in our charity work as well. Now, faith not only impacts the practitioner, it also has the potential to impact the poor directly. For example, faith improves health. A number of studies have established positive correlations between faith and health. Specifically, people of faith are happier, they have a greater sense of control, they feel life has purpose. They also have less depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. More than better mental health, people of faith also have better physical health, including a decreased risk of cancer and heart disease. As you might expect then, they also tend to live longer. Now, how is this important? Well, getting a job and keeping a job is the most likely route out of poverty, and good work requires good health. Speaking of work, faith has a role to play there too. Believing that God gifted mankind the earth to steward, as He gave the first man, Adam, a garden to steward, can change one's paradigm. Rather than work as a source of money, work becomes a source of fulfillment. We're all called to vocation. And when our faith informs that belief, we embrace work. Lastly, Research from the Institute for American Values discovered that churchgoers are statistically more likely to marry. Being that 75% of non-poor families are married, faith and marriage increase a person's likelihood of staying above the poverty line. So here are your takeaways for today. Number one, consider how you can more so model the characteristics of God in your work. He's compassionate, He's just, and He's expectant. And number two, look for ways to directly employ your faith in poverty-fighting efforts. Helping reconcile people to their Maker will improve the likelihood of escaping poverty through work, marriage, and better health. And number three, remember that even if the nonprofit you're working for isn't faith-based, most churches are willing to engage in ways that could be very beneficial. Maybe you could partner with the church to run a Celebrate Recovery program in your facility. Or maybe a church could come in and start a Jobs for Life work readiness program. We're all fighting on tough battlefronts, and it's good to be reminded that with God, nothing is impossible. So let's go out there today, fight poverty, and win.